So first of all, what I obviously need to say is thank you all very much for being here. It's really great to have you here, particularly Richard and Laura, but actually all of you, because it's the first chance we've had to talk about our project to a larger group, and we're just really excited to have you here. And particularly, to think about going on through the day when you're not going to have to just sit there and listen to us, but you're going to be able to talk and to share from your experience, and we're all looking forward to learning from you, because I know there's an awful lot of experience in the room of different kinds of work and different kinds of thinking on well-being that we will be the richer for hearing and for sharing. So the title of this was actually identified for me by my husband, Stan, and comes from a paper by Triandis. This is the little bit when he talks about it. Oh, sorry. Is that okay? So, well-being in the West, says Triandis, is conceived as reflecting a predominance of positive over negative personal emotions, but in the East, it is sometimes perceived as a social condition. The Jew, when asked if she was happy, an Indian woman said, "Don't ask me, ask my husband." So I thought this was a nice place to start. Obviously, Triandis is talking from a tradition in which he is reflecting on individualist versus collectivist orientations of cultures that some people in this room, myself included, are rather uneasy about. But still, it does talk to that relational notion of well-being that Laura was talking about. And I think that Don't Ask Me and the Ask My Husband parts are quite interesting for us to reflect on. So, as you know, our project is halfway through. That's the point at which we're starting getting anxious and thinking we should be putting some findings out there. So you're a bit guinea pigs in that, in terms of an opportunity to be able to try out some things with you. So what I'm going to present is not a learned paper, but really some thoughts about what we found and the cultural grounding of well-being, and particularly reflections on the process of doing the project and some of the difficulties that we've had in actually trying to come to forms of questioning that people can understand and respond to, and then that we can make sense of the answers that they give to us. So that last bit is my aspirational part. I'm not really going to do that, but hopefully the sorts of things that I say will be able to engender within you some questions and discussion for later on, in terms of reflecting back on the ways that the wellbeing literature talks about culture and how that has affected our understandings of well-being, and maybe ways in which we may want to think differently. So I'm going to start off by outlining the project, and then I'm going to talk about two aspects. First of all, I'm going to talk about place, because I think that what's surprising in work on culture within the well-being literature is there's actually very little about place. It's a kind of disembodied discussion of culture. And coming from my sort of background, where my PhD was based on sitting in a village and asking people silly questions that and generally wasting their time, but not wasting mine, that sense of place and the way that people put things together in their own context, in their own lives, in their own frameworks of meaning, seems to me tremendously important. And my concern with a lot of the discussion of culture within the well-being discourse is that that's lost. And what we have is very abstracted discussions, often very quantitative discussions, but even those discussions that are not quantitative are often very abstracted. So we typically have the Indian woman, and it often is a woman, who speaks for the whole of India, the whole of the East, and all we have is this little tidbit, and the Voices of the Poor is an example of that, of course, within development studies. Tidbits of people who have no place, in a sense. We place them within our discourse. So I wanted to start with that and talk a bit about the well-being issues that have come out of the two places where we are doing our research. And then the second part to talk about, or third part, to talk about the implications of what we found in our struggles in terms of the methodology for inquiries about well-being. So, of course, whenever we talk about well-being, we are aware that people define it in many different ways. And we have a rather kind of open definition of it. But what I wanted to draw attention to is that we are talking about well-being in terms of a holistic understanding of well-being, which has both objective and subjective data, which we're seeking to gather, and which pays some attention to exterior conditions, tries to get a sense of the collective and also of individual dimensions. So because we're grounded, at least within a development studies approach, obviously we are concerned about the economic, we're concerned about people, how people are actually doing, not just how they feel about how they're doing, and trying to get some sense of the relationship between those things. So the aim of our project, the ambition, it's a modest ambition as you would expect, is to develop a model of well-being that's grounded in the South. So that it's more like, and recognising, of course, it's only an approximation and it's something that is very much reconfigured through the Babel fish of Western academic discourse, but it's something more like the way that people there think about and talk and feel and act, rather than one that starts from assumptions of the West. And our ambition then, having worked on that model, is to be able to use it to explore the relationships between poverty and well-being, both quantitatively through a survey and qualitatively through interviews. And the two-way relationships, there's many, many ways, but let's call them two for the moment, between, on the one hand, how does poverty affect well-being, but also how might people's different well-being experiences and resources enable them to combat their poverty. So our research is in two communities, in Zambia and India, and they're both rather marginal communities within those countries. We've got 2 rounds of fieldwork of 3 to 4 months in each country, so if you see the big lines under my eyes, they're going to be even bigger this time next year when we're back in fieldwork mode. And in each location we're going to 350 respondents. And we've set it up because of our interest in relationship. We've set it up so that we talk to married couples, we talk to husbands and wives separately, so that we can get their own different views, and then have a way of being able to look at differences and similarities between the responses they give, and also 50 women heading households, obviously because of the concern about women heading households being often a relatively disadvantaged group. Our approach is not just a bottom-up approach. We don't go out and ask people what are your understandings of well-being in the way that the WED-Qual does. Rather, we thought, well, let's start at least from our best guess. Let's start from our own experience in research, our own reading, and try and draw on well-being and quality of life research. And then what we have done is try and refine the model through a mixed method research approach. So we have spent an awful lot of time trying to come up with the right kind of items in the survey. That is, items that work in a number of different ways. Items that work in order to please Stan in a statistical way, so that we can actually, they fit together, they hang together, and they, the correlations and differences between them tell us something useful and that can be tested in a statistical manner. We began by consulting with NGOs and other people whom they considered were people who had a good perspective on the locations. What were the local wellbeing issues? So we did do it that way, but not in the sense of actually going out and doing focus groups with other people. We then have intensively field tested, so a series of grounding and piloting starting in 2009, again 2010, 2011. So each time we go to the field, we try and work again to test out, are the questions that we're asking making sense to people? Are people finding it difficult to answer the questions that we're asking? In the ways that they answer what we ask, are they telling us something completely different from what we expected them to be talking to us about? And then coming back and reflecting on that and seeing, well, have we got things in the right places? Are we asking things that just don't make sense? Are there other things that we need to pick up on that we have not thought of ourselves? And we've also then tested that and revised it between the two rounds. So our ambition was that we would have a perfect survey from the beginning, which we would apply in India and in Zambia in round 1, and then in round 2, 2 years later, we would go back to those same people and be able to administer the same survey to them. What we in fact found was when we did the stats on the Zambia data, they didn't hang together in the way that we hoped that they would. So we had to do some major rethinking at that time, think, well, how can we redesign the survey, partly putting in questions that were relevant in India that weren't relevant in Zambia, but more significantly actually thinking about the ways that we word items, the ways that we organise ourselves, and I'll talk about this later, so that we can come up with something that does work statistically, because Stan was a very unhappy man at the time. And the good news is, we managed it. So, through that qualitative process of reflecting on the survey in India, in Zambia, and then reworking it to produce a survey that we could use in India, we have actually found that statistical testing works on the model in India, and we're coming up with non-random results of various kinds. So our model, I won't spend time on this because I know you'll have seen the briefing paper, but we have 7 domains, and it's a way of dividing up the world, but also, of course, recognising that there are important interactions between them. Very important as we'll see when we're thinking about place, is the wider environment. So one of the worries about well-being, if you're a development person, is that it does just individualise, is that it does kind of exclude all of the exterior factors that we know promote well-being, like the state, and many other different aspects of culture, but also of political economy, that are actually fundamental in terms of the levels of well-being that people experience. So we've got them there in our outer circle, and as you'll see from the discussion of place in a bit, they are actually very, very important in terms of our understanding, and whatever we do, we mustn't let go of those. So as I've said, surprisingly within discussion of culture and well-being, there's relatively little about place. And you have this kind of fictive displacing and replacing. So you have, Korean Americans compared with white Americans, and then the results of that being presented as though it's the East versus the West. So they're kind of replaced, having been displaced. There's lots of interesting and kind of fun stuff going on there. But our own experience in research has been that the place and the particularities of the ways that people are living has been really important and really problematic to us. So we thought we would make a virtue of it and stress the importance of it to others. And it's also the case, of course, that studies that look at inequality of well-being do emphasise place in a much more significant way. So our 2 places are Chiawa in Zambia and Saguja in India. And I'm going to use the terms Chiawa and Saguja throughout rather than Zambia and India, because we can't talk about the whole of those countries. India is obviously completely massive. Zambia is pretty massive too. What we're talking about really are the villages and communities where we have done research. So even claiming those titles is claiming rather too much. Thought rather than talk about the 2 places separately in terms of their different characteristics. Saguja is in Chhattisgarh, if any of you know India, so it's a new state that was kind of slivered off the edge of Madhya Pradesh in 2000. And Chiawa is a game management area which is on the edge of a national park, and that's very significant in terms of the sort of challenges that people face in terms of achieving well-being. But I thought rather than talk about them separately, what I'll do is talk about them together, and the common issues that seem to come up across the 2 places. The first is an obvious one, food and hunger. So in Chiawa, as you can see, significant numbers of people reporting going hungry. In India, on the other hand, in Saguja, what was most striking is when you ask people about their well-being, people would volunteer talking about the subsidised rice programme from the government that had made a tremendous difference. So from about 6 years ago, the mode of distribution of subsidised rice was changed, and people are now getting it in the way that they weren't, and it's very, very highly subsidised. So people are able to buy rice according to the categories where they that they're assessed to be at 1 or 2 or 3 rupees per kilo. And this, everybody said, has made a tremendous difference in terms of they used to be hungry and now we're not. Or as this woman said, now we can live our lives. Along with food and hunger, of course, come land and farming. So in both places, they're rather marginalised communities, ethnic minority communities, low technology and largely rain-fed agriculture. Land quality was an issue, more than land quantity for most people. In both places, issues about titles, lack of titles or lack of security of titles, and in Chiawa particularly, concerns about land grab. If you stand back from the two places, the most obvious difference between them is the role of the state and the presence of the state and the visibility of the state. The state, of course, has two forms. The state, on the one hand, is a provider, and in Chiawa, it was very difficult to see the state in that role. So you have a few minimal provision of health clinics, a few government offices, some government schools that in any case are having to be helped out by non-governmental action. When we talked with the NGO originally about what issues we should have in the survey, and coming from myself having done work in Bangladesh and our research officer being herself Indian, we were asking about the state and about state programs. And the NGO people said, there's nothing, there's no entitlement, there's no point in asking about that. It wasn't quite right, there is some relief food that is given in Chiawa, but it's fragmentary. By contrast, in Saguju you've got good roads, you've got the rice, you've got a rural employment scheme. Of course, the paradox is then you have many more complaints about corruption. As enforcer, the state as enforcer, there were more similarities between the two places. So as I said, Chiawa is a game management area, so conflicts between the people and the animals being protected. So a lot of issues of trampling of lands, trampling of crops, destruction of fields by animals, people not being able to do anything about it, and having the wildlife officers there to make sure that they didn't do anything about it. In Saguju, although formally people have got the people who we're doing research with have got rights in terms of customary rights to forest products, whether they actually receive those rights or not is a bit iffy, and there's certainly concerns about declining forest resources and what that will mean for them. In neither place is there much confidence in the police and justice system. Talking to the virtuous poor, one of the major issues in both places was actually alcohol. It was an issue for us because people were rather drunk and therefore not very good research participants. Although sometimes they were more ready to be research participants in that state than in their sobriety. So the picture from Zambia, no underage, you have to say it in order to be able to read it, a bar. And in Saguju from somebody who is, he says, a reformed person who used to have an alcohol problem, comparing his own community with another community, a higher status community, and saying the big difference between them is about alcohol. Not that that can necessarily be taken at face value, but it is an interesting example of people looking at their own communities and reflecting on common practices. And in the Saguju context, the Adivasi people, so sort of what were historically called tribal people in India, it's part of their culture, the drinking of alcohol. But it's then being seen as something which is actually holding them back, and holding them back in a collective way. So not in that village, but in one of the villages, they had actually there'd been a movement, an anti-alcohol movement, and they'd made a collective pledge that as a village they would give up the bottle. This collective pledge, as you can imagine, had not lasted altogether, and was not universally observed, but still it's an interesting example of people actually coming together and making a well-being choice. God and the gods, or rather disparagingly said, surprisingly God got looking in the WED research. In our research, people frequently talk about God and the gods. And they talk about God and the gods in different ways. So sometimes it's about trust, God will provide kind of thing, and sometimes it's about a sense of helplessness or insecurity. Apart from God, I've got no one to help me. But also very much about deliverance. So very often people talk about God and religion in the context of a healing that was experienced. Of course, we can't set aside the fact that there's very poor formal healthcare provided. And very important in terms of people being able to pledge themselves to a new life. So because they had then made a commitment to a particular guru, they were able to keep on a path that they considered was a better one for them. There's also, again, the collective dimensions of well-being within the Adivasi, so within Sarguja, an interesting environmental, but the Nef people will like this, an environmental understanding of well-being, in which there was a kind of reciprocal relationship that was envisaged between seeing the earth as a garden in which people's responsibility was to tend the garden so that God would see the beautiful flowers within it and then God would give rain in turn. So that sense of caring for the earth actually being a form of devotion, but also that reciprocity. And the reciprocity there is very strongly there in that woman's statements. When God is good to me, then life is good to me. If I stop praying to God, if I stop cultivating God, then obviously God will give me sorrow. So the two-way relationship there. Health, obviously health and well-being is a big issue. Health was also a big issue there, and as I've said, close ties to religion. Children, kids are a worry, we all know that. In both places there was an anxiety about children's future, about their education, about whether they would make the right choices. So here it's quite an interesting individualised way in which people talked about children in the future. And often it took the form of, if children do what I say, then they'll do well, which as a parent, of course, I can identify with very well. But sometimes it was, if children make the right choices, then they will do well. And I haven't got time to talk about it, but it was very interesting within Chiawa, especially the circulation of children between households. It was marked. And in a sense, the social network, but also children actually having a very hard time when they were sent off to other households. And often that was for education that they were being sent away. Social relations generally get a good rap. Social capitalists seem to be a good thing. And of course it is. But there's also a lot of ambivalence around social relationship. In both places, people talked about social support, that people would help them out. But they also talked about, and if you help them out, you're going to have to help out in turn. So anxiety is about reciprocity and the kinds of claims that you would open yourself up to. And particularly within Zambia, a great deal of emphasis on envy and on bewitchment. Bewitchment being about envy, being about other people. So not just a kind of random sense of the bad spirits, but particular sense of my neighbour or my mother-in-law who is doing bad things to me. And you can see a very interesting contrast between the two places there. So in both places there was a fear of harm from evil powers, quite high. But in Chiawa, very high correlation of that with, I believe that there are people who'd like to cause me harm. So an ambivalence of social relationship, and I think this is something that is really not paid the attention to in the literature that it should be. And something interesting for us to follow up and think about. So, reflections on place then. I think it underlies the importance of looking at domains. It underlies the importance of looking across different parts of people's lives to see how they're doing in them. But also, clearly it shows how important the relationships are between them. So, you may ask about health, but you may get God. These things obviously are not separate in people's lives, or not separate in people's minds, and the interrelations between them are very important for us to look at. It questions, I think, approaches like Maslow's, which identify a hierarchy of needs, which say, well, as long as you're hungry, you don't worry about these other things. And rather what we see is that people are hungry, but they are still worrying about other things. So there's a complexity and a coexistence. However, again and again, and these were very poor communities, so that is understandable, economic concerns were pervasive. And this shows through both in qualitative and in quantitative terms. So the ways in which people talked about their responses, how they explained, well, why are you saying that? We would ask them in a rather irritating way when they've just given us the answer. And they would often refer to economic situations, whether you asked about self or whether you asked about relationships, often it came back to economics. And quantitatively also, objective economic status is a significant and positive predictor of all the overall subjective questions that we asked. So you can see that the little ticks in the box. This is because I'm doing it. If Stan were doing it, then you get numbers, but as I'm doing it, you just get a tick. Forms of inquiry. This is one of our researchers in Zambia, who our local researchers who we've worked with have been tremendously important in this whole process of deliberative reasoning, team meetings, reflections, as we have gone through the process of the research. Ask my husband. So here, Triandis is spelling out a bit more how he understands this. It's all about, he says, collective understandings of well-being. However, it's occurred to me, maybe it was just a way of avoiding awkward questions. Ask him. Don't ask me. Our experience has been that people had significant difficulty in answering the standard style of, here's a statement, do you strongly agree to strongly disagree? And I have to say that we have some CPD survivors in the audience know, we have used exactly the same approach and many of the same items as we used in India, but somewhat reformulated for the context here, in the University of Bath, and people had no difficulty whatsoever in answering the questions. So there is a real difference. It's not just that we've got a dodgy survey. There is a real difference in terms of people's capacity to answer and the way people are schooled into understanding the sorts of questions that might be asked, how to abstract from their lives, and so on. There is an ongoing tension, I think, between the abstract and the concrete. So what we're seeking is something that is abstract so that we can look across lots of different contexts with a similar-ish survey, but abstract also because ultimately what we're trying to get is to abstract concepts that are driving the wellbeing model. On the other hand, for people to answer, it needs to be tangible. They need to know what you're asking about. They will ask you, well, what do you mean? So part of what we needed to do was actually come up with a standard number of examples, so that when people said, well, when you're asking this, what do you mean? We gave the same. Each of the team members gave the same examples, so that we didn't have a range of different examples being given, and then that sending off responses in all sorts of different ways. Partly this is about, and I think this emphasises actually the point about cultural difference, cultural kind of cognitive differences. Partly it's about structures of language. So some of the reasons why our current survey looks a bit peculiar is because it's translated back from Hindi. And Hindi is a much more concrete language. You have to say things in more concrete ways. It doesn't have the same sort of abstraction as everyday English has. So we ended up having more descriptive kind of questions than you would have within a standard survey. We also moved to questions rather than statements. So we moved to questions which people found easier to respond to, and then we had standard answers. So rather than having this range of strongly agree to strongly disagree, we would have particular answers that actually made sense in terms of those questions that we were asking. Aspirations, as we've heard, are seen to be an important aspect of well-being.